Hello, I'm Dr. Katherine Horton. This is the continuation of the frequently asked questions, and now I'm going to answer the more general questions about the system overall. And one of the questions that comes up quite a lot is about the intelligence agencies, that is, and the surveillance and the stalking and the shooting with microwave weapons and so on. But one of the questions that arises when people first hear about this organized stalking is, but how would they pay for all that, and actually, I mean, given that surveillance is one of their core jobs, it goes out of the main budget. But then when you have a situation like this, that over a very short period of time, the number of victims seem to have exploded, you can, I think, correlate it, and I think the data analysis is still being collected on this, and as victims come forward, we'll have a much better understanding. But it's already the case that, from what you see, there seems to be an explosion in the young victims, and these victims are, typically on Twitter and YouTube, and will complain about it publicly, and you can pick up a lot of these victims there. And that you can correlate, I believe. I mean, if I'm right, this is just, I didn't have the opportunity to actually do comprehensive data analysis on this. But from a rough estimate, I would say that there has been an explosion in the number of victims. And for the UK, this seems to be correlated with the doubling of the MI5 budget after 2003. So the Guardian has been reported as saying that the MI5 budget doubled, but the actual headcount tripled after 2003. So this is the actual overall funding, for these sort of enterprises. So the way to put that into context is always to think, well, if you had one MI5 beforehand, if the budget doubles, the amount of money that's in the system is enough to suddenly sustain 2 MI5s. I mean, this is staggering. This is just absolutely unbelievable. So you would have to, suddenly build up an entire new MI5 from scratch and make it reach the same size to, to cover the same sort of expenses. And key systems that take a lot to develop will not be, duplicated. And this explains why the budget doubled, but the actual headcount tripled, So if this amount of money that was freshly coming in, the size of your budget already, you would have to build a second independent MI5. Then you would have a lot of infrastructure costs and so on. But it's not, and this is why the headcount didn't just double; it tripled. And that's how you can put these numbers into context and think, yes, this is precisely what you would expect. Now, there are not that many, I think, reliable figures about the how much money MI5 actually gets. So there's always, how much is the defense budget, how much of that ends up with the intelligence agencies. It's kind of a black area, but there's also a gray zone because, for example, in Germany, it is public knowledge that the informants are paid, I think partially or maybe entirely, through tax benefits. And the idea is that if you pay them, it might show up in their bank account, but if you want to have a secret informant, what you do is they get their money at the end of the year, so they pay less tax or no tax, or So overall they end up with more money, but instead of having it in terms of salary, it will be at the end of the year bonus. I'm sure that there are many arrangements, but this one is publicly known. And what that tells you is that essentially you'll have to add that into the overall financial flow that you attribute to these secret services. So it's not just the money they get directly; it's the extra monetary perks that their agents and their their vast networks get from other sources. Now, the other thing is that in terms of the microwave weapons, you might be surprised just how cheap they are. So I think, from my estimate, you can get quite a lethal weapon for less than a laptop. And of course you need other devices and so on, but you can always reuse them. You know, you can use them several times, and it doesn't actually cost as much as you would think. And this is the really scary thing. Then in terms of the gang stalking and these surveillance flats, well, once you have hired gang stalkers and you've got this vast network, you can always make use of their flats. So if you picked your stalkers at key positions, and for example at busy roads and flats above shops tend to be rather cheap because you know, they're very loud and there's lots going on outside. But if you take those cheap flats, they probably will be inhabited by people who need the money. And if they need the money, then they are much more likely to become gang stalkers. And once they're gang stalkers, you can just you know, use their flat as a gathering ground, or to put equipment, to shoot at people, or to shoot at them as they're driving past or walking past, and so on. Then the other thing is, that's one thing that they asked me. They said, why would they continue shooting at you once you've been to the High Court? I mean, I had 3 High Court hearings, and the attacks after that exploded. And that's because if a court throws out your case, they are even more, encouraged, you know. They assault you even harder, and they also, these organizations have an extremely toxic culture and a psychopathic culture based around dominance, mutilation, punishment, and that's how they treat their own agents, as I understand. But someone external, they will treat the same way, because these idiots don't know any other way, you know. I mean, they will do whatever they've been doing for decades internally, and they will do the same thing externally, so they will attack you even harder. Sorry, it's just getting late and I'm just working through this. Oh yes, and then the other thing is also in the same category, that in a sense there is no incentive for them to stop ever. That's because they can just continue once they've picked you, and once they surveyed you and they know you don't know anybody important. Actually just continuing assaulting you is for them the most efficient thing to do, because eventually when you go to a doctor, they will just read out your medical file. So all the damage that they've done to you with these modern weapons, they can have the human testing, you know, the actual data from the human testing, by just reading out your medical file. And why should they stop? I mean, this will never be taken away from them, you know, so they think, and they will just continue doing it. Yes. So, and another argument was also that people said, well, if you went to the court and they stopped after that, it would be like an admission that they were doing it all along. I mean, of course, this doesn't hold up to scrutiny, because I know that MI5 is involved. I know that British intelligence is involved. I know that German intelligence is involved, and I know that Swiss intelligence is involved. Because you cannot commit these crimes and continue committing them after I've gone so public, after I've been, you know, to the High Court, after I emailed the BND, after I, you know, emailed also or written to the NDB, the Swiss intelligence agency, after I've been on YouTube, after I've been on a radio show, after I keep bleating on about it. It's pretty obvious that it couldn't escape their attention. And claiming that it's organized crime is pretty hard to do, given how they treated me when I was in the High Court going up against British intelligence. But now the situation is that they are so lawless, they will just do it anyway. They will think, well, we'll just mutilate this woman to death. One more won't really matter, because we've mutilated so many other people to death, you know. I mean, you can find these death lists, and I'm absolutely serious. These people complained about it for years. They went to the police, they were ignored, they complained to politicians. It's an open secret by now that this is a public extermination system. This is a public execution system that's being run. Okay, the other questions I should, in this section, I should put into a separate video because they're quite important. Then other questions about the system overall. Why would they go to such length? What would be the point in it all? And as far as the point is concerned, it makes total sense if you take into account illegal activities. So illegal weapons testing, human experimentation, intimidation of people, takedown operations, removing dissidents from society so that the criminal cartel can just proliferate. It makes total sense. And then when they've got carte blanche, they can go to whichever length they want to. That's just unfortunately how it is. Unless there's an incentive not to, a system will just continue expanding and continue rolling forwards. And then there's also another thing to argue that if you, I mean, there's two ways. One of them is to say, oh, this is all intentional, and this is, and I think this is really how it is. So the intelligence agencies traditionally have always been a takedown system, a human experimentation system, a maiming, mutilation, and human, what's it called? A human destruction system. But if you want to argue another way, which is maybe more, how to put it, more salon compatible, should you try to argue this in court, you can also say, and this argument is also equally valid and will lead to the same result, that, well, this is not a normal system anymore. This is a system out of control. So then you kind of imply that the system once upon a time was under control, which I don't think it ever was. I don't think there's anything in the history of any intelligence agency in the world to give you supporting evidence for that it has ever been under control. Well, what we would call control, not cartel control, but actual public control. I don't think that has ever been the case. I think we're now on new ground. People publicly complaining about the intelligence agencies literally must be news to them. And, a little stupid woman like me going into the open court, into the open high court, and, waxing lyrical about the ins and outs of the intelligence agencies must have been news to the heads of the intelligence agencies. I think that must have rocked their world in some sort of, some way. Because I haven't heard of a case where people have done that. But so what we're essentially doing is we're now up against this frontier. And traditionally, these intelligence agencies, they weren't in charge of just murdering people for the inner cartel. Whatever the cartel was, the royalties in the olden days, these days more corporation and moneyed cartels. But that's their job, right? So they, historically, they would not have to have submitted themselves to scrutiny. So some stupid little woman going up to them and saying, "Hey, could we just change things so that you don't mutilate me to death?" Must be the biggest surprise to these guys. Like, what? We didn't have that before. Since when do these women complain about being mutilated? That's novel ground. So it takes some time for them to get used to it, so we have to give them time. And that's why, I can't really expect them to stop the mutilation straight away after calling out essentially the intelligence cartel and say, oi, hey, MI6, BND and NDB, could you please stop it? I mean, it takes some time for them to realize that actually maybe in the 21st century public executions are not the best way to go. But given that they murdered Dr. Ronnie Kilder just last year, in 2015, you can kind of tell that they still have a learning curve that they haven't really engaged with so far, So we still are up against essentially these kind of old guys who live in the Cold War, live in some sort of funny world where that's totally okay. So in that sense, they've never been under control, but you can claim, okay, they have been under control and this is now just running out of control. And in a sense, it is running out of even the little control that they had, because this system is being expanded. And what these idiots don't realize is that whatever is being developed now is it's a system pivot. So all these brain interference and brain control weapons that they have developed, whoever has got the technical skill to control not even the satellites, it's more like the software and the bugs and all these the backdoors to the satellites and sophisticated software viruses and computer algorithms, whoever controls those controls the minds. And that's what's so, I find it surprising these people go put so much money into these brain control things, because I want to say you better be careful, because unless you're the guy who is up to date with the newest software versioning, the newest software and the newest software bugs, you're putting your brain kind of at the mercy of some sort of computer geeks, which might not even be your favorite computer geeks on whom you're relying on and who you think are part of the part of your inner circle. And that's because anybody who's ever worked on complex computer software knows, even if you've developed a computer system yourself initially, as it grows more complex, the person who's got the edge is the person who is in it at the moment. So I have worked on software where I was involved in the beginning, then it was passed to some colleagues who then worked on it, and then by the time you see your own software and what they've done to it and what they've added to it, yes, of course you understand the key functionality, but the bells and whistles, and more importantly, the actual unexpected, unintended interactions between different software modules, that you really cannot, it's again mathematically not possible for you to have your head wrapped around that, because it wasn't there when you looked at it. And if many people are working on it, you have to be rather clever, rather genius to anticipate where they would have made mistakes and how they would interact non-linearly. And for the most mortals, this is a highly non-trivial exercise to do, that whose complication will increase exponentially as the software grows more complicated. So in that sense, yes, these systems are running out of control, and our current leadership, the one thing I can tell them is they will not be the ones in command of the brain control machines. The people in command of that really ultimately tomorrow will be those who are writing the software today and are up to date. That's kind of like my experience from working on really complex software at CERN. I mean, if I were Mr. Global and company, I would be shitting myself, because I would have built and paid for this ginormous, super interactive, decentralized brain interference and control system. And, the older you get, the less you can kind of keep up. And it's a bit like the same with your, mobile phone, It kind of gets ever more complex, and the kiddies who are the youngest and who are the most clued in and who basically spend most hours glued to the software debugging it will be the ones who will be in ultimate control. I mean, okay, there's small corrections. Sometimes you're more experienced, and maybe if you've got a high IQ, you can do more sophisticated things and so on. But even so, I mean, ballpark, this is what's going to be the case. The people who will be in control of the brains will not be the people who paid for it. Problem? I mean, for me it's the same. I don't mind which criminal is trying to control my mind. I'm just saying that right now on me, they're guinea pigging a brain control device that is not designed for me. It's designed for the high value targets, the people with really a lot of money, and therefore a lot of money to lose. Do you see? I would be crapping myself, frankly. I think that the richest people and the most powerful people in the world should try to have to shut down, because this is being shipped to them. They think that they can control it, but really they can't. But anyway, so in that sense, the system has run out of control. And then the experiences from systems analysis, that a system that has run out of control does not behave in a common sense way. Okay, so everything I said about software, if you haven't worked on software, then it's probably over your head and you don't really understand what I'm talking. That's more like a hints to the experts. But overall, you can say that by the time you have a system whereby the valuable people of your society are being mutilated to death slowly by having cancer weapons and cancer beams shot into their bodies repeatedly, something about the system has run out of control. And when a system has run out of control, common sense is the last thing that you find there. And my favorite example is that of so I think that was in the papers, so I have to remind myself of the exact details and who was involved. But as I remember it, it was the German job center, so the unemployment, what's it called, like not institute, but governmental organization in charge of trying to get people back into jobs and trying to get pay out the unemployment benefits and so on. And people were claiming benefits for unemployment, and the department handling the cases was so inundated that managers started putting a lot of pressure on to have the backlog worked off as quickly as possible. And because people couldn't manage, and these were really idiotic managers, they didn't understand systems. So in the end, the only way the poor employees could cope, or at least so they thought, was to just get rid of certain files, of claim files. So if you've got a big backlog, you can either work it off or just try to shred certain files. And these people decided to shred or disappear certain files. And of course the benefit claimants came back and they said, hey, where are our benefits? And then the workers at the front desk said, well, we can't find it in the system, so you must have just not come and submitted it. And of course the unemployed people said, no, we did, and some of them could prove it. And then this entire scandal blew up, and in the end it turned out that was because people were shredding files. And they were shredding files because that was the only way they thought that they could cope. The only way that they could satisfy the demands of the managers. So, and that is a classic example of a system run out of control. So of course, if you approach it with a global view, you can tell that the scandal is going to break, and shredding files is not a good idea. But in the situation, if you put enough pressure on people, they will start doing stupid stuff. They will do whatever is the only solution to solve their problem then and there. So if you don't give people an avenue out of a situation, they will end up doing stupid stuff. And, if you were now a benefits claimant and your file would have disappeared, you would think it's personal, because that's what humans do. If you go into a complex system, you still have this kind of like tunnel view, and you think it's all about you. But this is not how the system works. The system works top down, and you're just one element in it. So it's never personal. But then, this is the only way you could think, and you would think, oh, they really hate me, and no, that's not how the system works. It's a system run out of control internally, and of course there's no common sense, but that's just what happened, and there is no point looking for common sense. So to ask what's the point in it all, well, the only point you can think about is weapons testing of pharmaceuticals and nanoparticles, and implants, which have been shown to have been implanted in some victims of the intelligence agencies. But if you claim that this is a system out of control, maybe to make it more palatable to a judge, then you can also say, well, there's no point looking for common sense or an overarching point, because that's the hallmark of a system out of control, that it defies logical sense. If it didn't, it wouldn't be out of control. Okay. Another very common question is, you are alleging extremely sick stuff. Why would they do such a thing? And there the answer is quite simply 1% of the population is psychopaths. I think certain statistics have shown that in certain high power jobs, the psychopaths can be as high as 5%. And then when they get a job in the secret services, they love it, because they can do whatever they like, any sort of illegal or abusive acts, with impunity. So in a sense, it's not surprising to find sick stuff in an opaque system that gives people a lot of power over other people's private life, their intimate life, their communications. It's essentially the incentives for malpractice are stupendous. So if you didn't find any sick stuff, that would be unusual. In a normal, systems analysis says that unless there's some special mechanism to de-incentivize things that have a high incentive, then humans will respond to incentives. That is the fundamental principle of economics. Humans respond to incentives. This isn't new, and the same thing will apply to these complex human systems. So, a certain fraction of the population is sadists, a certain fraction is psychopaths, and a certain fraction is just corrupt. If you have a system that is utterly opaque and has no internal safety mechanisms, then expect to see really horrific abuses and sick stuff, Okay. Then on top of that, and I think as an artifact, as a consequence of the fact that there are so many psychopaths inside the system, it's now also public knowledge that gang stalkers are specifically trained to degrade and humiliate the target by smirking, by laughing and jeering while the target is being disconcerted or even abused. I think this was mentioned by Julianne McKinney, one of the US Army military intelligence whistleblowers. If I remember correctly in an interview, she specifically pointed out that they are trained to laugh. I think it was her. But this you can also see if you're at the mercy of this gang stalking system. So people will sometimes have a jeering grin on their face, even though there's no reason for that. And actually, I've got one video where I've filmed a harassment theater, which was at the end of a chain of systematic gang stalking, where this guy started shouting at me and started being aggressive to me, and then, I just let the interaction pass. But the gang stalker, there's always like a walk past. So at the very end of the scene, someone else will be walking past and try to reinforce this thing, and that's usually where the jeering comes in. So I've got this like harassing guy, and then he just buggers off, and as he's buggering off, this woman walks towards me, and you can actually on the video see beautifully this like contemptful grin that she has towards me, and it's hilarious because it doesn't make any sense, but that's exactly when you reach the stage that you're not bothered by the actual situation. Every time you get this sort of stuff, you're like, brilliant, I've been telling people about this, and now I've got it on film. It's fantastic. So, I don't really want to release it over the internet because it has, you can see faces clearly. But, for any court case, I can submit that sort of stuff, that this is really how the system works. Beautiful. But anyway, then when you allege the sick stuff, also remember that a lot of the Secret Service are actually now on the employment of private corporations and private cartels, and they might want to just have really sick stuff done to you just to get rid of you. So you would expect it, and it's because of the opaqueness, because of the Official Secrets Act, and because of the fact that, in these systems you would expect, I would say, something like at least 5% psychopaths, if not actually substantially more. But just mathematically or just statistically, from that fact alone, you would expect that people on a surveillance list would sooner or later fall victim of horrific abuses, because there are no incentives not to commit them. So of course it would happen at some point, That's the real way to look at it. And also the incentives to use you and your life and your body are just so high. I mean, you can be used as a prop to train young spies. You can be used as target practice, to test out modern weapons. That's what what I am most days. You can be used as a patsy in false flag operations. Then you can have medical experiments run on you for someone to earn money from the pharma industry. You can have weapons tested on you, and have the intelligence agencies earn money, or specific agents earn money from the arms industry or the Ministry of Defense. You can people can run psychological or social experiments on you and earn money from government departments and private contractors. You can have the same thing, run medical experiments, psychological and social experiments on you to teach young spies on how to pull this sort of stuff off. What else can you do? Agents can also just have fun with you, just live out their own predilections. And they do. I think it's some of the perks of the job, which is actively encouraged, to just keep these utterly otherwise totally void and gormless idiots just entertained. then the other incentive is also to make stuff up about you so that they stay on your case before they actually get transferred to someone who's much more violent or, actually much more dangerous. So there's also clear incentive in that. So, the incentives to commit abuses are so high. I would be surprised if anybody would resist the temptation, to be honest. Okay. Then very, very briefly, I already discussed it. People say, oh God, no, this sounds so excessive. I mean, how could it have run so out of control? If you go with the it has run out of control sort of, reasoning, as I've explained, they've never were under control, but hey. Then you just say, well, if you had to portray it such that this is literally the first time the intelligence agencies have run out of control, yeah. Then you say, well, it's because it's a pyramidal hierarchy. It's because 1 to 5% are psychopaths, and there's plenty of documentation for that. And then these psychopaths migrate to the top, as I've shown in my video about, pointing out capture and capture by psychopaths. And then you have on top of that compartmentalization. So, there's no correctional force within the system because one department can't really see into another department, lower down or on the ground. Then you have a thing called need to know policy. So the people on a certain task, on a certain job will only be told what they need to know. And then you've got, of course, the Official Secrets Act for total opacity towards the outside world. Well, with this configuration, you end up with uncontrollable maiming and murdering by design. Because as soon as you've got a psychopath at the top, they will just do that for laughs. Do you see? Even without the incentive of weapons testing or earning money from the arms industry. So this is by design. It's essentially the intelligence agencies and these shit legacy systems are like having a chainsaw or a lawnmower or something with fast rotating blades like a lathe, industrial lathe, and absolutely no safety mechanisms. Like no safety catches, no safety covers, just like openly rotating blades, in an engineering equipment. Well, any engineer who looks at that and thinks, okay, hang on, this is a system that can potentially kill and maim. If you don't put in some sort of safety device actively trying to prevent maiming and murder, then someone sooner or later will be murdered and maimed by this sort of system. But what you have to understand is that human systems are exactly the same as engineering systems. If there's a problem or a potential problem, you have to put in safety catches. If you don't put them in by design, it's just a question of time until that eventuality, comes into being. It's just a question of time until an accident happens. You see? So it's not a surprising thing. Oh yes, and then also if you want to give other examples to people who are are worried about, oh, how can a system like that run so out of control, then stay in the security area, because that's the sort of kind of the personality of the people, it's kind of like the same. And then instead of taking the job center example, you can bring up an example from the Supreme Court. Actually, it was one of those cases I watched at the Supreme Court, live, streamed online. Very interesting case. And that was the case of R, in brackets, Roberts, versus Met, which is the Metropolitan Police. And what this was about is essentially, I think, a lady called Roberts, who was, I'm not sure if she was a black lady, but she was certainly part of, I think, a minority, who was really annoyed by the stop and search, by the indiscriminate stop and search that was rampant in the UK. And essentially, before the regulation was tightened, stop and search without suspicion, I should say. So this is stop and search. Sorry, for those who are not from the UK, this is the kind of the police was given the right to stop and search absolutely anybody without suspicion. Okay, so they didn't even have to have a justified suspicion about it. It was just, oi, you, or just stop you and just search you. Okay, but they did have it, so I think this was stop and search without suspicion. And the stop and search, when it was first brought in without regulations, so essentially without safety mechanisms, there were 100,000 cases of stop and search, I think, per year. 100,000 cases, and needless to say, the stop and search didn't really turn up a fat lot. That was the problem. Essentially, the minorities that started complaining, and essentially it was Asian and black guys saying why we're being stopped all the time, and it kind of looked really much like, somehow like discrimination, because I bet you that the number of stop and search was not the same in Mayfair as it was in Croydon, I bet you. And really what they should have done is actually Westminster would have been the perfect, place, a total hotbed of drugs to really just like clear out with stop and search. Like anybody who comes out of the UK Parliament should have been just stopped and searched and tested for drugs. Really, I think the country could have been revolutionized within a month. But that's not how it went. They were, harassing people in Croydon and in all these places, so... as always in Peckham, and you can imagine. So these people complained, were not heard, but eventually so many people complained that they tightened the regulation, and it went from 100,000 cases to 200. And I still have to hear the person, maybe from the Met, who says, dear God, since we stopped having stop and search without suspicion, our crime rates exploded. So this is a classic example of a system out of control. You give people this sort of tool, they'll use it just because they think, oh, they have to use it, and it doesn't turn up anything, and then they think, oh, let's try this guy. I mean, we have to somehow find something now that we've got stop and search. We have to somehow, and of course, if it were that easy, we could just clear out crime, but it's not. You have to be a bit cleverer than that. But that's another example of a system running out of control. And then finally, I know I've been going on for a long time. They also say things like, the intelligence agencies are, really professional people. They would never do such a thing. When at that point, you just refer them to the archives, maybe to the declassified archives, and you say, okay, let's go through the list. Every decade of the 20th century, and let's look at the abuses, and I bet you, I'm not the most informed because frankly, I'm up to here with the intelligence agencies, but you can do the exercise yourself. I just quickly scanned and put together all the stuff that I, could find very quickly. So starting in the 1930s, say, because I didn't really have, any time nor inclination to try to trawl the net or libraries for information going further back. But in the 1930s, I remind you, we had the Gestapo, right? That wasn't very nice. Meanwhile, in the US, they had the Tuskegee experiments, where they, I think this is how it's pronounced, right? Tuskegee? Where they, as I understand it, were infecting black men with syphilis and then watched them degrade as part of this illness. But they infected them on purpose with syphilis. How sick is that? In the 1940s, we had the Gestapo really going properly nuts. And then in, I think already in the US, they had MK Ultra. They also had Project Paperclip, where they took all the Nazi scientists and brought them to the US. But then also they infected 400 prisoners with malaria in the US. And the Nazis at the Nuremberg trials cited these experiments done in the US in defense of their own experiments. So it's like, okay, we're Nazis, but look at those Nazis. Why is it okay if they are doing it? It's like, pots and kettles. They are all messed up in the head. That's the point. 1950s, we had the Stasi, right, in East Germany. And we also had the continuation of MK Ultra and COINTELPRO, and the covert spreading of biological agents in US cities for weapons testing. In the 1960s, we had the Stasi. They had MK Ultra and COINTELPRO, and they also had MK Ultra and stuff like that in the UK. In the 1970s, they still have the Stasi in Germany. They have MK Ultra and COINTELPRO still going, and MK Ultra in Britain, and others similar, pretty much the same experiments really that were done in the US. 1980s, you have still the Stasi. You have still MK Ultra and COINTELPRO, but now, as we found out, they are now kind of follow-on programs where people were, the official government program was stopped, and instead it was passed to contractors, so people, if they got sacked, they formed companies and continued the same stuff, as it seems to be the case. Please look into this and research, but we now have public statements from US intelligence agents saying, yeah, no, these projects were never stopped. Then in the 1990s, we still have these follow-on programs, continuing, actually ramping up, and all this satellite stuff, and maybe that was already around in the 1980s, I have no idea, but certainly this sort of weapons testing with satellites and mind control and so on. Then in the 2000s, I would say this MK Ultra and COINTELPRO Stasi style stalking never stopped. That's what I would say. But it kind of like got toned down and was made to disappear off the radar for a bit. But then in the early 2000s, we had the torture and extraordinary rendition programs. Then we heard about mass surveillance. Well, mass surveillance we already had in the 1990s. And now we're in the 2010s, and what the victims are claiming is that we have essentially COINTELPRO, MK Ultra, the satellite system, and mass surveillance. Are you surprised? We had it every frickin' decade since the 1930s. What the fuck is so surprising? Nothing. It's just a continuation. It's essentially, you've got these intelligence agencies full of just utterly like messed up in the head psychopaths doing the same old shit over and over and over. Oh, what would it be like to control the human mind? What would it be like to control other people? Just classic psychopath. Oh yeah, let's really disconcert them, destroy them psychologically like the Stasi and COINTELPRO. Oh yeah, let's destroy their financial life, their social life, their financial life. Let's destroy their marriage. Let's destroy their health. It's the same crap. Really, it is the same freaking crap. It's like saying, a serial killer like Jack the Ripper in the 19th century say, oh my God, that was so sick. Yeah, well, we still have serial killers doing the same stuff. It's the same stuff. And now the only difference is that these serial killers are in government employment, doing the same stuff, and nothing has been put into place to actually stop them doing this. So what do you think will happen? If you have Jack the Ripper literally under the Official Secrets Act, and what do you expect to happen? Like Harold Shipman, who's been said to have killed like 300 people. After you've killed 100 people, what do you expect to happen next? Like, what the fuck do you expect? Unless you do something, it will continue just like that. So, we have literally all these documented programs, MK Ultra and COINTELPRO and the Stasi, Zersetzung, going for decades. Then they go silent briefly, and then people say, oh, it seems to be the Stasi, Zersetzung, COINTELPRO and MK Ultra, and people are like, no, they would never do such a thing. Hey, they've been doing the same thing for since they were born as an organization. So, okay, please don't ask this question again. I hope this is now clear. Okay, then a very good question is, have they nothing better to do? And I would say, no. I think this is their job. I think this is what they're there for. That's why it's secret. Because if it was all kosher, or all okay, or all halal, or whatever you want to call it, then it wouldn't have to be secret. Do you see? So as soon as you've got a secret service, you've got a criminal service. You see, it's just that putting, like the criminal intelligence service, it just doesn't sound the same. So they say the secret intelligence service. But this is what it essentially means. The secret services are the criminal services. They are the services provided to governments and cartels doing the criminal stuff. And essentially what this battle is, the victim saying, we really want these criminals stopped now. I guess what all the victims, and I think everybody who's got their head screwed on in society, should be saying is that in the 21st century, after now, we can go on trying to conquer each other's countries, or we could just shut these criminals down. Maybe we could just have a police force, a publicly accountable anti-terrorism unit, or we could just call it like organized crime unit, publicly accountable, and we could all do away with the secret services, because as soon as a country has got a secret service, it is signaling it has a criminal service. We provide criminal services. If they weren't criminal, they wouldn't have to be secret. And whatever these people are doing, it's going to be criminal. Because if it's just a normal police force and they think you're doing something criminal, then okay, they might be able to just survey you for some time. If it's publicly accountable, fair enough. End of story. Why do you need a secret service? You know, and then you realize that any sort of espionage always will be somehow getting hold of the intellectual property of other countries. And then you can say, yeah, but you need the secret service because another country might be like developing weapons that you don't keep up with. Actually, there's a systems analysis argument to say that the fastest development, the most resilient, and the most, really, but it's about speed. So the fastest development is really the transparent development. Because then everybody's got the same information, it's all transparent. And then everybody can contribute to just kicking the ball a bit further. So public development, unless they are really ginormous, sorry, I'm using ginormous again, massive monetary imbalances, publicly, you know, no copyright, just open, free, add to it as you like, and copy and replicate and make better as you like sort of development, is actually the fastest, the cheapest, and the most competitive. And I think I can show that also using systems analysis. The reason why, for example, the arms industry and the space races and stuff like that seem to be just so ahead of time is because the actual money pumped into them is by a large margin, by a by orders of magnitude more than what's pumped into public research. And that's why it seems that, these sort of things are so much more advanced, and secret development is so much more advanced. It isn't. Literally, if 9 billion people can contribute, and you just always say, this is where we're up to, can you take it further? And then, okay, you do this, I do this. We make everything public, so that as you have the ideas, you can add to my project, your project. That's actually the quickest way to do things. But currently we have the situation that these countries are all stuck in the old paradigm, and they're like, oh, no, they are actually, they are developing weapons, so we have to develop our weapons in secret. And actually, what's going to happen is, because every country knows that a secret development is going on, they are spying, watching each other like hawks. And actually the secret programs to the intelligence agencies are the best known, because that's what they keep like staring at all the time. And I think, I think Vladimir Putin put it really well the other day. When it's like a fairly recent comment, I think maximum a year ago, when he said, well, they know what we know, or they know what we know that they know that we know, and this endless iteration, and we know what they're going to develop next year and the year after, and it's pretty easy to map out this sort of development. So they know about each other's weapons anyway. So why not just make it transparent? Because then we can actually prevent abuses, and everybody could contribute in kind of cushioning the effect of these weapons against illicit use, which would then protect the cartel holders in turn. But this is kind of like a complex reasoning that's, I think, way beyond most arms dealers and most heads of intelligence. But ultimately, this is how it is. So right now, we're with these legacy systems where secrets like shh, and actually the most secret projects are the most watched, by professional saboteurs and intelligence agents. So what the hell? I would maintain that if you've got a shitty, crappy little project in some back door of a university, you've got more chances of it not being known than some top cutting-edge research project, for the arms industry. I think that's just what it's like. But there we go. Final question, why don't they go after criminals? Well, there's a very, very good reason why they don't go after criminals, because criminals are stressful and dangerous. That's why. If you're actually a stalker and you have to stalk a proper, like, proper organized criminal who's a real psychopath and doesn't have a problem with getting his heavies, you know, putting a bullet into your head or having you swimming at the bottom of the Thames, I mean, it's a pretty stressful job to have, to kind of tailgate those guys, you know. So people tend not to do that. So this will arise naturally. Say, if you just assume that the takedown of civilians and dissidents were not the main target of the secret intelligence agencies, but actually fighting terrorism or actually going after organized crime, yeah, I mean, we've got, you know, evidence to the contrary, but let's just assume for the sake of the argument, then what would naturally happen is that in all systems you have an admixture of false positives by default. So by accident, someone will end up on a list. Oh, sorry, my battery is going flat. Just a second before this dies. You will have an admixture of essentially just innocent people. And as soon as a set of stalkers ends up stalking an innocent person, he would keep very, very, very quiet about it. Because he would say, well, if I now speak up and say this person is innocent, next week I'll be, you know, stalking, you know, Mr. Head of the Mafia, and I really don't want to do that. So just by this process alone, innocent people would be kept on, and if there's no mechanism to weed these out, which, you know, we know that there isn't, then innocent people will be stalked until the end of their life because they're innocent. And the intelligence agencies doing the stalking would very quickly realize that there's absolutely no danger emanating from this person, and they would think, oh, thank God, you know. So this is essentially a system tendency to focus the surveillance on innocent people. And then before long they will say, okay, I'm useless, the intelligence or the surveillance is useless, but what if I earn the system money by just doing maybe weapons testing on them, because then I'm safe and then I just shoot at an innocent person and I know it's okay. You see, so this is another system tendency, and this is a systems tendency, you know. It's and if it's a systems tendency that's inbuilt into this sort of system, it will be unavoidable, and unless there are measurements or measures to stop it, it will just expand. So everything in the intelligence agencies, even if they didn't start off being malicious takedown operations, and you have to remember that they grew out of the surveillance systems of the old royal families, so they didn't have an incentive for public service. Those were takedown systems. Yeah? So in the history of these systems, there's nothing that actually inscribed public service on them. Yeah, keep that in mind. But even so, right, even if you didn't assume that they started off as malicious takedown operations, even so, there's a systems tendency tending towards the surveillance of innocent people. So either way, you would end up in the situation we have today. And then finally, okay, there's this thing that people at some point hit this, and they say, oh my God, this is so terrible. I can't believe this is happening. I can't believe this is happening. Well, I'm sorry to tell you, what you can or cannot believe will have no impact on reality. Absolutely no impact on reality. And I mean, I could give you examples, you know, if you really need convincing. But you know, you could drag up historical examples. Could the people in 1912 believe that most of their young men are going to die soon? Probably not. Could that they have believed that so many would die in Britain that Oxford and Cambridge would be depleted of academics? Probably not. And nevertheless, it happened. And then, you know, 25 years later, could people believe that civilized countries, in inverted commas, like Russia and Germany, because they were civilized for that time, would wipe out a large part of their own population, you know, very soon? No. Nevertheless, it happened. Okay, and then taking more recent examples, right? I mean, could you have believed that thousands of people would be murdered in you know, in 9/11 the week before? No, I don't think so. But it happened, you know, and many, many, many other things. I mean, could you have believed that the BBC would announce the collapse of what's it called, World Trade Center 7, ahead of time and live on television, and then pull a straight face for 15 years after that. I couldn't have believed it before, yet it happened. You know, could you have believed that entire countries would be invaded on trumped up, you know, and trumped up allegations and falsified dossiers? I mean, it happened, right? We know it happened. Could you have believed that the British government would, you know, go forward with a war despite the largest ever protest in British history marching through London? I think that was the Iraq War. You know, yet it happened. And I could go on and on and on and on and on. So, what you can believe, what you can or cannot believe, has absolutely no bearing on reality. That's the sad truth. Thank you for listening. Other questions will be answered in a separate video. Bye for now.